A young boy, just 13 years old, dives into a raging flood to save an elderly man clinging to life. The next morning, a sleek black car pulls up outside his battered home, carrying a message that will change everything. What happens next? A story of courage, kindness, and a reward no one could have imagined. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning dawned with an unsettling quiet over Bayou Ridge, Louisiana. The town, nestled along the Bayou Verde River, was no stranger to heavy rains, but the stillness today carried an unusual weight. Caleb McCallum, a wiry 13-year-old with sandy brown hair and a determined gaze, stepped out onto the creaky porch of the family's small wooden house. The sky overhead was a dull gray, thick clouds swirling in slow motion like an ominous warning. "Caleb, breakfast!" his mother, Marlene McCallum, called from the kitchen. Her voice carried a mix of exhaustion and warmth, as it always did. Caleb hesitated, scanning the horizon where the river wound lazily through the town. The water looked higher than usual, edging closer to the tops of the levees. His stomach knotted, though he couldn't explain why. He turned and headed inside, brushing off the unease. Inside, the aroma of eggs and biscuits filled the air. Rosie, his 8-year-old sister, sat cross-legged on the couch, her small hands clutched around a stuffed bear she'd named Benny. She looked up as Caleb entered, her face lighting up. "Did you see it?" Rosie asked, bouncing in her seat. "See what?" Caleb replied, grabbing a biscuit from the kitchen counter. "The sky. It looks like one of those storms in the movies," Rosie said with wide eyes, her voice tinged with both fear and excitement. Marlene glanced over from the stove, her brow furrowed. "It's just some rain, Rosie. Don't go scaring yourself over nothing." But her tone was less convincing than usual. The family sat together briefly, a rarity given Marlene's demanding job at the Riverbend Diner. Caleb noticed how she picked at her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, breaking the silence. Marlene blinked and managed a small smile. "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking about work." Caleb didn't press further. He knew the financial strain on his mother was heavier than she let on. Ever since his dad left, Marlene had worked tirelessly to keep their heads above water, both figuratively and now, possibly literally. By late morning, the town began to buzz with activity. Caleb stepped outside again, this time with Rosie trailing behind him. The once quiet street was now filled with neighbors chatting anxiously. Some were boarding up windows. Others were moving valuables to higher shelves inside their homes. From across the street, Mrs. Joanne Price, their elderly neighbor, waved a handkerchief. "Caleb, be a dear and help me with this tarp, would you?" Caleb jogged over, leaving Rosie on the porch. Mrs. Price, a sweet but frail woman, struggled with a sheet of plastic she was attempting to secure over her flower beds. "Looks like we might get a big one, doesn't it?" she said, her voice trembling. "Yeah, maybe," Caleb replied, tightening the tarp over the stakes. As he worked, he noticed Eldon Garrison, the elderly man who lived a few houses down, standing by his porch. Unlike the rest of the neighbors, Mr. Garrison wasn't boarding up windows or moving furniture. Instead, he leaned against the railing, staring at the river with an unreadable expression. Caleb finished with Mrs. Price and walked back to his porch, where Rosie was now drawing with chalk on the wooden planks. "Stay here," he told her, and she nodded, absorbed in her artwork. Caleb crossed the street toward Mr. Garrison. "You need any help, Mr. Garrison?" Caleb asked, standing at the edge of the man's yard. Mr. Garrison looked up, his face creased with lines that told stories of hard years. "Help? No, boy, I've lived through storms worse than this. No reason to panic yet." But Caleb caught a flicker of doubt in the old man's eyes before he turned back toward the river. That evening, the rain began to fall in earnest. The rhythmic tapping on the roof filled the small house as Caleb and Rosie sat by the window, watching droplets race down the glass. Marlene stood nearby, folding laundry, her face tight with concentration. "Mom, do you think we should leave, like they're saying on the news?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. Marlene sighed, placing a folded shirt on the table. "Caleb, we can't just leave. Where would we go? Besides, these warnings don't always mean much. People here know how to handle some rain." "But what if it's not just rain?" Caleb pressed. Marlene hesitated, her hands stilling on a towel. "We'll be fine." We've made it through storms before, haven't we? Caleb nodded, though his instincts told him otherwise. He glanced at Rosie, who was now holding Benny close to her chest, her wide eyes reflecting the stormy sky outside. As the night deepened, the rain intensified. Caleb lay awake on his small bed, the sound of water pounding against the roof echoing in his ears. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and distant flashes of lightning illuminated the town in brief, eerie bursts. Sleep eluded him as he stared at the ceiling, the uneasy feeling from earlier now gnawing at his chest. He couldn't shake the image of the river, the water lapping dangerously close to the levees. Finally, Caleb sat up and moved to the window. The streetlights flickered in the storm, casting long shadows over the deserted road. Across the way, he could see Mr. Garrison's house, its porch light still glowing faintly. As the clock struck midnight, Caleb whispered to himself, "Something's coming. I can feel it." The wind roared like a freight train outside the McCallum home, shaking the walls and rattling the windows. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, his heart racing as the storm grew more violent. Rain lashed against the house in relentless sheets, drowning out all other sounds. He glanced at his sister Rosie, who was curled up on the couch in the living room, clutching her stuffed bear, Benny, tightly to her chest. Across the room, their mother, Marlene, paced anxiously. The dim glow of the television flickered as the local news anchor's voice crackled through the static. "This is not a drill," the reporter said, his tone urgent. "Residents of Bayou Ridge are advised to seek higher ground immediately. Floodwaters from the Bayou Verde have breached the levees in several areas, and the situation is worsening by the hour." Marlene clicked the TV off and turned to Caleb, her face pale. "We need to stay put for now. The roads will be too dangerous." "But what if the water keeps rising?" Caleb asked, the knot of worry in his stomach tightening. Marlene sighed, rubbing her temples. "We'll be fine. The house is on slightly higher ground. We just need to stay calm." As dawn broke, it brought no relief, only more chaos. Caleb woke to the sound of frantic voices outside. He rushed to the window and saw neighbors wading through knee-deep water, carrying children and pets to safety. The muddy floodwaters surged down the street, sweeping away trash cans, bicycles, and anything else in their path. "Mama, it's getting worse," Caleb said, panic creeping into his voice. Marlene stood by the door, peering out at the rising water. "We need to move fast, get the essentials, just the things we can carry." Caleb hurried to grab backpacks, stuffing them with canned food, water bottles, and a flashlight. Rosie clung to Benny, her eyes wide with fear. "Caleb," Rosie whispered, her voice trembling. "Are we going to be okay?" "We'll be fine, Rosie," Caleb said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just stick close to me." As Marlene secured the front door, Caleb spotted their neighbor, Mrs. Joanne Price, struggling to carry a heavy box through the water outside. "I'll be right back," Caleb shouted, ignoring Marlene's protests. The cold water soaked through Caleb's sneakers as he splashed toward Mrs. Price. She turned to him, her frail hands trembling as she held the box above the rising floodwaters. "Caleb, thank goodness. I couldn't leave this behind. It's all I have left," she said, her voice cracking. Caleb gently took the box from her. "Let's get you to higher ground, Mrs. Price." He guided her to a group of neighbors gathered on an elevated porch. After ensuring she was safe, Caleb turned back toward his house, his heart sinking as the water crept closer to their front steps. As Caleb approached home, he noticed Eldon Garrison's house a few doors down. The old man was still on his porch, gripping the railing as the water surged around him. "Mr. Garrison," Caleb called out, waving his arms. "You need to get out of there." The elderly man shook his head stubbornly. "I'm not leaving my house, boy. I've lived through worse storms than this." But Caleb could see the fear in his eyes. The water was already up to Mr. Garrison's knees, and the current was growing stronger by the second. Caleb ran back to his porch, where Marlene was calling him inside. "Caleb, get in here. It's too dangerous out there." "I can't, Mama," Caleb said, his voice firm. "Mr. Garrison needs help. I can't just leave him." Before Marlene could argue, Caleb grabbed a raincoat and waded back into the floodwaters. The water was icy cold and relentless, pulling at Caleb's legs with every step. Debris floated past him, branches, overturned trash bins, even a stray tire. He reached Mr. Garrison's porch, his heart pounding. "Mr. Garrison, grab my hand," Caleb shouted over the roar of the storm. The old man hesitated, his grip tightening on the railing. "You shouldn't be out here, Caleb. It's too dangerous." "I'm not leaving without you," Caleb insisted, his eyes blazing with determination. Finally, Mr. Garrison relented, reaching out to Caleb. The boy gripped his arm tightly and helped him step down into the water. The current was stronger than Caleb had anticipated, nearly knocking them both off their feet. "Hold on to me!" Caleb yelled, wrapping one arm around Mr. Garrison's waist as they struggled through the chest-deep water. The journey to safety was agonizingly slow. Every step felt like a battle against the current, which seemed determined to drag them under. Caleb's muscles burned, but he refused to let go. At one point, a massive branch came hurtling toward them, carried by the rushing water. Caleb barely managed to duck, pulling Mr. Garrison with him. The branch crashed into the side of a house, splintering on impact. "We're almost there!" Caleb shouted, though he wasn't sure how much farther they could go. Finally, they reached a neighbor's elevated porch. Caleb hoisted Mr. Garrison onto the steps before collapsing beside him, gasping for breath. "You're a brave kid," Mr. Garrison said, his voice shaking. "I thought I was done for." "We're not safe yet," Caleb replied, looking out at the rising water. "We need to keep moving." The floodwaters showed no signs of slowing. The porch beneath them creaked ominously, the wooden beams straining under the pressure. Caleb's heart sank as he realized their refuge wouldn't hold for long. "Mr. Garrison, we have to find higher ground," Caleb said, his voice urgent. The old man nodded, his face pale. "What do we do now?" Caleb scanned the area, his eyes landing on a garage roof a few yards away. It was higher than the porch and looked sturdy enough to hold them. "We're going to that roof," Caleb said, determination hardening his voice. "How are we supposed to get there?" Mr. Garrison asked, doubt flickering in his eyes. "We'll figure it out," Caleb said, more to himself than to Mr. Garrison. As the floodwaters lapped at their feet, Caleb prepared for the next daunting challenge. The porch trembled beneath them, the sound of creaking wood mingling with the roar of the floodwaters. Caleb clenched his fists, his gaze locked on the garage roof a few yards away. It was higher, sturdier, a better chance of survival. But the water between them and that safety churned like a living beast, dark and relentless. "Mr. Garrison," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the fear twisting in his stomach, "we can't stay here. The porch isn't going to hold." The older man nodded, his face pale and drawn. "You're right, boy, but how are we going to make it? That water, it's got teeth." Caleb's jaw tightened. "We'll make it. I'll get us there." Caleb scanned the area, searching for anything that could help them cross the swirling current. His eyes landed on a large plank of wood wedged against a nearby fence, partially submerged. It wasn't much, but it could give them something to hold on to. "I'll grab that plank," Caleb said, pointing toward it. "Stay here. I'll be right back." "No!" Mr. Garrison grabbed Caleb's arm with surprising strength. "You're not going out there alone. It's too dangerous." "I have to," Caleb insisted, his voice firm. "We need something to help us cross. Just stay put." Before Mr. Garrison could argue further, Caleb stepped into the water. The icy current bit at his legs, nearly knocking him off balance. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, each step a battle against the relentless force. As Caleb reached the plank, a powerful surge of water slammed into him, forcing him to grab onto a nearby railing for support. His heart pounded as he steadied himself, pulling the plank free. It was heavier than he'd anticipated, the weight of the waterlogged wood testing his strength. Step by agonizing step, Caleb dragged the plank back toward the porch. The current clawed at him, threatening to sweep him away with each movement. By the time he reached Mr. Garrison, his arms were trembling from the effort. "Got it," Caleb panted, dropping the plank onto the porch. Mr. Garrison reached out, patting Caleb's shoulder. "You're braver than most men I know, kid. Now, let's get moving." Caleb positioned the plank across the gap between the porch and the garage roof. The makeshift bridge wobbled under the force of the wind and rain, but it held steady enough to offer a slim chance of crossing. "You go first," Caleb said, helping Mr. Garrison onto the plank. The old man hesitated, his hands gripping the edges tightly. "I'm not as steady as I used to be, boy." "You don't have to be steady. Just trust me," Caleb urged. With a deep breath, Mr. Garrison began to crawl across the plank, his movements slow and deliberate. The wind howled around them, and the rain pelted his back like needles. Caleb held his breath, watching every inch of progress with bated breath. Halfway across, the plank creaked loudly, causing Mr. Garrison to freeze. "Keep going!" Caleb shouted over the storm. Mr. Garrison nodded and pushed forward, his hands trembling. Finally, he reached the garage roof, collapsing onto its flat surface with a relieved gasp. "Your turn, Caleb!" Mr. Garrison called, his voice barely audible over the storm. Caleb stepped onto the plank, the water surging below like a hungry beast waiting for a misstep. The wood bowed slightly under his weight, but he moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. Just as he reached the roof, a massive branch floated by, slamming into the plank and snapping it in two. Caleb lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the roof with both hands. "Hold on, boy!" Mr. Garrison shouted, scrambling to grab Caleb's arms. With one final heave, Mr. Garrison helped pull Caleb onto the roof. They lay there for a moment, gasping for breath as the remnants of the plank floated away into the flood. For the first time in what felt like hours, the two of them were safe, at least for now. The roof was sturdy, and the water hadn't reached it yet. Caleb sat up, his chest heaving, and looked at Mr. Garrison. "We made it," Caleb said, his voice shaky but triumphant. Mr. Garrison chuckled weakly. "Barely. You've got the guts of a soldier boy. Your grandpa would have been proud." At the mention of his grandfather, Caleb's throat tightened. He looked away, blinking back the sting of tears. "I couldn't save him," Caleb murmured. "But I'm not letting anyone else go like that." Mr. Garrison nodded solemnly. "You've done more than most grown men would have. Don't carry that weight alone, son." As they rested, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The water below continued to rise, swallowing fences, cars, and entire sections of the neighborhood. Debris crashed against the sides of buildings, and the wind's relentless howl seemed to shake the very foundation of the town. The garage roof groaned under the strain, and Caleb's heart sank. "This roof isn't going to hold forever," he said. Mr. Garrison glanced around, his face grim. "Then, what do we do, boy? We can't keep running." Caleb's mind raced. Across the way, he spotted another building, a two-story house that was still above the floodwaters. It was farther than the garage, but it was their best chance. "We go there," Caleb said, pointing toward the house. Mr. Garrison followed his gaze, his expression darkening. "That's a long way, Caleb." "I know," Caleb replied, determination hardening his voice. "But we don't have a choice." The gap between the garage and the house was too wide for another plank. Caleb knew they would have to wade through the water again, a risk that made his stomach churn. "We'll go slow," Caleb said, helping Mr. Garrison to his feet. "Stick close to me and don't let go." The old man nodded, his jaw set with resolve. As they stepped into the water, the current was stronger than ever. Caleb gritted his teeth, keeping a firm grip on Mr. Garrison's arm. Every step felt like a battle, the water clawing at their legs with relentless force. Halfway to the house, a large wave surged toward them, knocking Mr. Garrison off balance. Caleb lunged, grabbing him before he could fall. "I've got you!" Caleb shouted, his voice raw with effort. Together, they pushed forward, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. By the time they reached the house, Caleb's legs felt like lead, but relief flooded him as he helped Mr. Garrison onto the porch steps. The house's second-story roof offered a more secure refuge. Using a drain pipe, Caleb guided Mr. Garrison up, step by painful step. The pipe groaned under their weight, but it held long enough for both of them to reach the roof. They collapsed side by side, soaked to the bone and shivering in the cold. The rain lashed against them, but the sense of accomplishment was undeniable. "We made it," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Garrison smiled faintly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Because of you, boy. You've got the heart of a lion." Caleb looked out at the flooded town, his mind racing with questions. How much longer could they hold out? And when, if ever, would help arrive? The rain poured relentlessly as Caleb and Mr. Garrison lay sprawled on the roof, their chests heaving from the grueling climb. The house beneath them creaked ominously, but for now, It was holding steady against the unrelenting floodwaters. Caleb wiped the rain from his face, scanning the horizon for any sign of rescue. "Still no help," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Mr. Garrison, lying flat beside him, coughed and adjusted his position. "We're alive, boy. That's more than I thought I'd be saying an hour ago." Caleb nodded, though the weight of their precarious situation pressed heavily on his chest. The flood showed no sign of receding, and with each passing minute, the water inched closer to the roof. "Your grandpa ever tell you about me?" Mr. Garrison asked after a long silence, his voice cracking under the strain of exhaustion. Caleb shook his head. "Not much. Just that you used to help out around the docks when he worked there." Mr. Garrison chuckled weakly. "Helped out? More like caused trouble. He was a good man, your grandpa, hard-working, honest. I never did tell him how much I admired that." Caleb's throat tightened. He stared out at the water, his mind replaying the day they'd lost his grandfather in a flood just like this one. "I wish I could have done something for him back then. I didn't even try." Mr. Garrison turned to Caleb, his gaze sharp despite the weariness in his eyes. "You were just a kid. Ain't no shame in not being able to do the impossible." "I could have done something," Caleb insisted, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't let it happen again. Not to you, not to anyone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain beat down, cold and relentless, as if determined to wash away what little hope they had left. The roof beneath them groaned loudly, snapping Caleb out of his thoughts. He glanced at Mr. Garrison, who raised an eyebrow. "You hear that?" Caleb asked. "Hard not to," Mr. Garrison replied. "This house won't last forever, Caleb." "We need to move again," Caleb said, sitting up. "And where exactly do you propose we go?" Mr. Garrison asked, gesturing to the endless expanse of floodwaters surrounding them. Caleb scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a taller building in the distance. It was a church, its steeple jutting above the waterline like a beacon of hope. "There," Caleb said, pointing. Mr. Garrison squinted, his expression dubious. "That's a long way, boy. You sure we can make it?" "We don't have a choice," Caleb replied. Using a piece of wood as a makeshift paddle, Caleb fashioned a crude raft from floating debris they managed to collect around the roof. It wasn't much, a few planks tied together with strips of fabric, but it was better than braving the current on foot. "Climb on," Caleb instructed, holding the raft steady. Mr. Garrison grumbled under his breath, but obeyed, his joints creaking as he eased himself onto the shaky platform. Caleb followed, crouching low to maintain balance. The current was stronger than ever, pushing and pulling the raft in unpredictable directions. Caleb used the plank to steer as best he could, his muscles burning with the effort. Halfway to the church, a massive wave surged toward them, carrying with it a tangle of debris, broken furniture, shattered wood, and even a capsized boat. "Look out!" Mr. Garrison shouted, his voice filled with panic. Caleb dug the plank into the water, trying to steer them away, but the wave hit the raft with brutal force, knocking them both into the floodwaters. The icy water closed over Caleb's head, and for a terrifying moment, he couldn't tell which way was up. Kicking furiously, he broke the surface, gasping for air. "Mr. Garrison!" Caleb shouted, his voice hoarse. The older man was a few yards away, clinging desperately to a piece of debris. Caleb swam to him, his limbs screaming in protest, and grabbed his arm. "I've got you," Caleb said, pulling Mr. Garrison onto a nearby section of roof that jutted just above the water. "Kid, you're going to give me a heart attack," Mr. Garrison muttered, coughing up water. Caleb managed a weak smile. "Just hang on, we're almost there." The church was closer now, its steeple rising above the chaos like a sanctuary. Caleb and Mr. Garrison used the floating debris to push themselves the final stretch, finally reaching the base of the building. The water lapped at the second-story windows as Caleb climbed onto the narrow ledge, helping Mr. Garrison follow. From there, they scaled the steeple, the climb slow and treacherous, but offering them a much-needed reprieve from the flood. Sitting on the small platform beneath the steeple, Caleb and Mr. Garrison surveyed the devastation. The town of Bayou Ridge was almost completely submerged, its streets turned into rivers, its homes reduced to floating wreckage. For a while, they sat in silence, the storm raging around them. Caleb's mind raced, but his body was too exhausted to move. "You've got guts, Caleb," Mr. Garrison said finally. "Most folks wouldn't have made it this far." Caleb shrugged, staring out at the water. "I just did what I had to do." "You've got more than that, boy," Mr. Garrison replied. "You've got heart, and sometimes that's what makes all the difference." As the storm raged on, Caleb allowed himself a small flicker of hope. They had made it this far. Somehow, they would survive. The church steeple swayed slightly in the relentless wind, creaking with every gust. Caleb and Mr. Garrison sat huddled on the narrow platform, their clothes soaked and clinging to their skin. Below them, the floodwaters churned, carrying fragments of their drowned town. Caleb's gaze was fixed on the horizon, scanning for any sign of rescue. A helicopter, a boat, anything. "Still no help," Caleb murmured, breaking the heavy silence. Mr. Garrison coughed, clutching his side. His breaths came shallow and uneven, a troubling sign. "You saved us this far, boy, but we're running out of time. I hate to admit it, but I don't think this old body can take much more." "We're not giving up," Caleb said firmly, though his hands trembled from the cold. "There has to be a way to get someone's attention. We just need to hold on a little longer." The storm raged on, merciless and unyielding, testing their endurance at every turn. Minutes bled into hours. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the floodwaters crept closer to the steeple's base. Caleb leaned back against the wooden frame, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids, when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping. His eyes snapped open, and he strained to hear over the storm. The sound grew louder, steadier. A helicopter. "Mr. Garrison!" Caleb shouted, shaking the older man awake. "Do you hear that? It's a helicopter!" Mr. Garrison stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You're not imagining it, are you, boy?" "No." Caleb stood, nearly losing his balance on the slippery platform. He waved his arms frantically, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Over here! We're here!" The spotlight of the helicopter swept across the flooded town, its beam cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. For a heart-stopping moment, it passed right over them, leaving them in darkness again. "Come on, come back!" Caleb yelled, his voice cracking. He grabbed a loose piece of wood from the platform and began waving it, hoping to catch the pilot's attention. The spotlight returned, this time locking onto the church steeple. Caleb's heart leapt as the helicopter hovered overhead, its powerful blades churning the air. A rescuer leaned out, shouting instructions as a harness was lowered. "They see us!" Caleb turned to Mr. Garrison, relief flooding his face. "We're getting out of here!" The harness swayed wildly in the wind as it descended. Caleb grabbed it and secured it around Mr. Garrison's chest, tightening the straps with shaking hands. "Your turn first," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "No," Mr. Garrison protested weakly. "You go, boy. You're the one who deserves to live." "Stop talking like that," Caleb snapped. "You're going first, and that's final." The older man nodded reluctantly, his strength too depleted to argue further. Caleb signaled to the rescuer, and the harness began lifting Mr. Garrison into the air. As Mr. Garrison rose toward safety, the wind intensified, and the platform beneath Caleb groaned ominously. He felt the wood shift under his feet, and a sickening crack filled the air. "Not now," Caleb whispered, his heart pounding. The platform gave way, sending Caleb tumbling. He scrambled desperately, his fingers finding the edge of the roof. Dangling above the raging floodwaters, he gritted his teeth and hauled himself back up with every ounce of strength he had left. Above him, Mr. Garrison reached the helicopter, the rescuer immediately securing him inside. The harness descended again, swaying dangerously in the wind. Caleb grabbed it and slipped it over his shoulders, signaling he was ready. As the line tightened, lifting him off the roof, the platform finally collapsed, splintering into the water below. The ascent felt like an eternity. The wind buffeted him from all sides, and the cold stung his skin, but Caleb kept his eyes locked on the helicopter. When strong hands finally pulled him inside, he collapsed onto the floor, shivering but alive. The helicopter carried them to an emergency shelter, a high school gymnasium that had been converted into a refuge for flood victims. Caleb's legs felt like jelly as he stepped onto solid ground, but his heart was lighter, knowing they were safe. Inside the gym, the scene was a mix of relief and chaos. Families hugged tightly, Volunteers handed out blankets and food, and the hum of voices filled the air. "Caleb!" a familiar voice called out. He turned to see his mother, Marlene, running toward him with Rosie in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped Caleb in a fierce hug. "I thought I lost you," Marlene sobbed, holding him tightly. Caleb hugged her back, his own tears spilling over. "I'm okay, Mom. We're all okay." Rosie clung to his side, her small hand gripping his shirt. "You're a hero, Caleb," she said, her voice full of awe. Across the gym, Mr. Garrison was being attended to by paramedics. Once he was stable, he waved Caleb over. The boy hesitated, then walked to the older man's cot. "You've got guts, kid," Mr. Garrison said, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. "You didn't just save my life, you reminded me what it means to fight for it." Caleb smiled shyly, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Mr. Garrison replied firmly. "You did what most wouldn't." "Thank you, Caleb. I owe you everything." As the night gave way to dawn, the floodwaters began to recede. Caleb stood at the gymnasium window, watching the sun rise over the waterlogged town. The destruction was staggering, but there was also a sense of hope, a chance to rebuild. Marlene joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Caleb," she said softly. Caleb nodded, his gaze steady. "Yeah, we will. Together." The sun climbed higher into the gray-streaked sky as Caleb stood by the window of the shelter gymnasium, staring out at the flooded remains of Bayou Ridge. The waters, though beginning to recede, had left an indelible mark on the town. Debris floated in sluggish currents, and rooftops that had barely peaked above the floodline were now marred with mud and wreckage. Behind Caleb, the shelter buzzed with the controlled chaos of relief efforts. Volunteers handed out blankets and food. Children cried for lost toys, and families clung together, unsure of what the next steps would be. Caleb's body ached from exhaustion, but his mind remained sharp. Every passing moment brought new challenges. "Caleb," Marlene called softly, walking toward him with Rosie trailing close behind. Marlene's face, though etched with fatigue, carried a faint glimmer of hope. "They're organizing air rescues to check for people still stranded," she explained. "They need volunteers who know the area to help direct them." Caleb nodded without hesitation. "I'll go." Marlene frowned, her worry lines deepening. "Are you sure? You've already done so much." "I can help," Caleb insisted, his voice steady. "I know the town better than most people. If there's anyone left out there, we can't leave them behind." Rosie tugged at his sleeve, her wide eyes brimming with concern. "Will you be okay, Caleb?" He knelt down, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be fine, Rosie. You just stay with Mom, okay?" Reluctantly, Rosie nodded, clutching her stuffed bear tighter. Caleb joined a small group of volunteers being briefed by a rescue team. The leader, a tall man named Captain Reyes, spoke with calm authority. "We're sending helicopters to the hardest-hit areas," Captain Reyes explained, pointing to a map of Bayou Ridge spread across a folding table. "You'll guide the pilots to specific locations where people might still be trapped." Caleb scanned the map, his finger tracing the streets and landmarks he knew by heart. His eyes lingered on a section near the Bayou Verde River. "This area," he said, tapping the map. "There's a row of houses back here. A lot of older folks live there. Mrs. Price, Mr. Thompson, the Callaways. They might still need help." Reyes nodded. "Good call. Let's get moving." Caleb climbed into the helicopter, its interior cramped but filled with purpose. The rotors roared to life, vibrating through his bones as the aircraft lifted off the ground. The town unfolded below him in a patchwork of destruction. Rooftops submerged, streets transformed into rivers, and cars piled against buildings like forgotten toys. Caleb's heart tightened as he surveyed the damage, his thoughts racing with concern for those still unaccounted for. "You're doing good, kid," said Reyes, who sat beside Caleb, headset in place. "Keep your eyes peeled. Every second counts." Caleb nodded, leaning closer to the window. As the helicopter hovered over a partially submerged neighborhood, Caleb's sharp eyes caught movement on a rooftop. A man waved a piece of white cloth, and beside him, a woman clutched two small children. "There!" Caleb shouted, pointing. Reyes relayed the coordinates to the pilot, who maneuvered the helicopter lower. A rescuer prepared to descend with a harness, but the wind picked up, causing the aircraft to sway. Caleb held his breath as the rescuer battled the elements, finally reaching the family. One by one, they were hoisted into the helicopter. The children clung to their mother, their faces streaked with tears and mud. "Thank you," the man said hoarsely, his voice breaking. "We've got more to find," Caleb said, determination lighting his eyes. As they continued their search, the helicopter's radio crackled with urgency. "Team Bravo to Captain Reyes," a voice called. "We've got a situation on the east side. A levee breach has left several families stranded, and the water's rising fast. We need backup." Reyes exchanged a glance with Caleb. "East side, that's where the row of houses you mentioned is, isn't it?" Caleb's stomach twisted. "We have to go there, now." The pilot adjusted their course, and the helicopter sped toward the east side, the drone of its rotors slicing through the stormy air. The scene was worse than Caleb had imagined. The levee breach had unleashed a torrent of water that engulfed the neighborhood. A few families had managed to climb onto rooftops, waving desperately for help, while others were clinging to debris in the water. Caleb's eyes scanned the area, his heart sinking as he recognized Mrs. Price's house. The elderly woman stood on her porch, ankle-deep in water that was rapidly rising. "She won't make it much longer," Caleb said urgently. The helicopter descended, and Caleb prepared to go down with the rescuer. "You're sure about this?" Reyes asked, his expression grim. "I'm sure," Caleb replied, fastening the harness around his chest. The wind howled as Caleb was lowered toward Mrs. Price's porch. The old woman looked up, her face etched with fear and relief. "Caleb!" she cried, reaching for him. "Hold on, Mrs. Price," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. He secured the harness around her, shouting instructions to the rescuer above. As Mrs. Price was lifted to safety, Caleb turned to see a young boy clinging to a tree nearby, his cries barely audible over the storm. Without hesitation, Caleb waded through the chest-deep water, the current threatening to sweep him away. "I've got you," Caleb said, grabbing the boy and holding him close. The helicopter returned, and both Caleb and the boy were hoisted aboard. By the time they returned to the shelter, Caleb's body felt like it had been through a war. But the sight of the rescued families, safe and reunited, made every ache and bruise worth it. Marlene ran to him as he stepped off the helicopter, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You're going to give me a heart attack, Caleb," she said, her voice trembling. Caleb managed a tired smile. It was worth it. Nearby, Mrs. Price approached, leaning on a volunteer for support. Her eyes were filled with gratitude. "Caleb McCallum," she said, her voice quivering, "you're a blessing to this town. Don't you ever forget that." That night, the shelter quieted as families settled into makeshift beds. Caleb lay awake, his body too tired to move, but his mind too restless to sleep. He thought of the people still missing, the homes destroyed, and the long road ahead for Bayou Ridge. But he also thought of the lives saved, the resilience of the town, and the bonds forged in the face of disaster. "We'll rebuild," Caleb whispered to himself. "We'll make it through this." And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe it. The morning sun broke through the thinning clouds, casting a pale glow over the shelter's muddy parking lot. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a battered but resilient Bayou Ridge. The air smelled of damp earth and faintly of gasoline from the countless vehicles abandoned in floodwaters. Caleb stood outside the shelter with Rosie by his side, her small hand gripping his tightly. "You think things will ever go back to normal?" she asked, her voice soft and uncertain. Caleb knelt down to meet her gaze. "Maybe not the same normal," he said, "but we'll make it better. You'll see." Marlene joined them, her arms crossed as she surveyed the wreckage that was once their neighborhood. "It's going to be a long road," she murmured, "but we're alive, and that's what matters." As they spoke, a distant rumble echoed through the muddy streets. Caleb squinted toward the sound, his eyes catching a glimpse of something moving slowly down the road, a sleek black car, its tires caked in mud. The car approached the shelter, its presence an oddity in the midst of the disaster. Most vehicles in the area were battered trucks or emergency response vehicles. This car, however, gleamed as though untouched by the storm, its dark paint reflecting the morning sunlight. It rolled to a stop just outside the shelter's entrance. Caleb exchanged a puzzled glance with his mother. "Who could that be?" Marlene wondered aloud. The car door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a crisp, dark suit that seemed completely out of place amidst the mud and chaos. His polished shoes sank slightly into the soft ground as he closed the door and adjusted his tie. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm looking for Caleb McCallum." Caleb froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "That's me," he said cautiously, stepping forward. The man turned toward him, his expression softening. "My name is Richard Garrison. I believe you saved my father's life." Caleb blinked, startled. "Mr. Garrison's your father?" Richard nodded. "Yes, he told me everything, about the storm, the flood, and how you risked your life to help him. I came as soon as I could to thank you in person." Marlene stepped closer, her hand resting protectively on Caleb's shoulder. "It was the right thing to do," she said carefully. Richard's gaze softened further. "It was more than that. You showed courage that most adults wouldn't muster. My father owes you his life, and so do I." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to Caleb. "What's this?" Caleb asked, eyeing it warily. "Consider it a small token of my gratitude," Richard said, "for your bravery." Caleb hesitated, glancing at his mother. Marlene looked equally unsure but gave a small nod. Caleb took the envelope and opened it, his eyes widening at the sight of several crisp bills. "This is too much," Caleb stammered. "It's not enough," Richard replied firmly. "But it's a start. Use it to help your family, rebuild your home, or anything else you might need." The weight of the envelope in Caleb's hands felt surreal. He looked at his mother, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you," Marlene said, her voice trembling. "This means more than you know." Richard nodded, glancing around at the shelter and the people milling about. "If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask. My family will be supporting the recovery efforts here for as long as it takes." As he turned to leave, Caleb called after him. "Mr. Garrison, tell your dad I said hi." Richard smiled. "I will, and he'll be thrilled to hear it." The black car pulled away, its tires leaving faint tracks in the muddy lot. Caleb watched it disappear down the road, the envelope still clutched in his hand. Back inside the shelter, Caleb gathered his mother and Rosie, sitting at one of the folding tables. He opened the envelope again, spreading the bills out on the table. "Mom, this could really help," he said quietly. Marlene nodded, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "It's enough to make a real difference. We could start fixing up the house, replace what we lost." Rosie's eyes lit up. "Can we get new toys too?" Caleb chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Maybe a few. But first, we need to focus on the important stuff." The three of them talked long into the morning, making plans for how to use the money wisely. For the first time since the storm, a sense of hope filled the air. As the day progressed, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he could do. The shelter was crowded with families who had lost everything, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair. He approached one of the volunteers, a young woman named Claire, who had been coordinating supply distributions. "Hey," Caleb said, "I was wondering, how are we doing on supplies?" Claire sighed, wiping her forehead. "Not great. We're running low on food and blankets, and there are still a lot of people out there who haven't made it to the shelter yet." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "What if we use some of this money to help? Buy more supplies, maybe even help rebuild?" Claire's eyes widened. "That's a generous offer, Caleb. Are you sure?" "Yeah," Caleb said firmly. "We're all in this together, right?" With Claire's help, Caleb made arrangements to use part of the money to purchase additional supplies for the shelter. They worked with local volunteers to distribute food, blankets, and clothing to those in need. The impact was immediate. Families who had been on the verge of despair found a renewed sense of hope. Children smiled as they received warm meals, and parents expressed heartfelt gratitude for the support. Marlene watched Caleb from across the room, her heart swelling with pride. "That boy of mine," she whispered to herself. "He's got a heart as big as this town." As the sun began to set, Caleb stepped outside, the muddy ground squelching beneath his boots. Rosie ran up to him, holding a small flower she had found growing near the shelter's edge. "For you," she said, her smile bright. Caleb took the flower, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thanks, Rosie." Marlene joined them, wrapping an arm around Caleb's shoulders. "You've done so much, Caleb, more than anyone could have asked." Caleb looked out at the horizon, where the floodwaters were slowly retreating, revealing the scars left behind. "We've all done a lot, Mom, but there's still so much to do." He turned to Rosie and Marlene, determination burning in his eyes. "We're going to rebuild, not just our house, but this whole town, and it's going to be better than ever." The floodwaters had begun their slow retreat, leaving behind a battered landscape of mud-soaked homes, uprooted trees, and scattered debris. Caleb stood at the edge of the shelter's parking lot, staring out at what used to be the vibrant town of Bayou Ridge. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and the faint tang of mildew, and the faint sound of hammers and voices in the distance signaled the first signs of rebuilding. Behind him, Rosie's laughter broke through the air as she played with a group of children near the shelter's entrance. Caleb smiled faintly, her joy like a fragile ray of sunshine in the midst of so much loss. His mother, Marlene, walked up beside him, her arms crossed as she surveyed the wreckage. "It's going to take a long time," she murmured. Caleb nodded. "But we'll get there." The moment of quiet was interrupted by the sound of an approaching truck. Caleb turned to see a flatbed piled high with tools, lumber, and buckets of paint pulling into the lot. At the wheel was Mr. Jenkins, a longtime neighbor and one of the first to organize relief efforts. "Look what I managed to scrounge up," Mr. Jenkins called as he climbed out of the cab. Caleb jogged over, his face lighting up at the sight of the supplies. "This is amazing, Mr. Jenkins. Where'd you get all this?" "Called in some favors," Jenkins replied, his voice gruff but warm, "and a couple of folks from out of town pitched in. Figured it was time we started putting things back together." That afternoon, the gymnasium shelter transformed into a hive of activity. Caleb helped Mr. Jenkins unload the truck, sorting supplies into piles for different neighborhoods. Volunteers, many of them residents of Bayou Ridge, began forming teams to tackle the most urgent repairs. Caleb found himself in charge of one group, which included Rosie, Marlene, and a handful of neighbors he barely knew before the flood. They started with Mrs. Price's house, her porch still sagging from the weight of the floodwaters. "This old thing might just fall apart if you sneeze on it too hard," Mrs. Price joked, her dry humor earning a chuckle from the group. "Good thing we've got plenty of hands to hold it together," Caleb replied, picking up a hammer. As they worked, Caleb marveled at how quickly people began to bond. Neighbors who had only exchanged polite waves before now shared stories, laughter, and the occasional tear as they hammered nails and scrubbed away mud. By mid-afternoon, a black SUV rolled into the neighborhood, drawing curious glances. The door opened, and Richard Garrison stepped out, his polished shoes replaced by rugged boots. "Thought I'd lend a hand," he said, pulling gloves from his pocket. Caleb blinked in surprise. "You? Here?" Richard smiled faintly. "I'm not much for sitting on the sidelines. Besides, my father insists on hearing updates every hour, and I figured the best way to keep him happy is to make some real progress." The sight of Richard, a man clearly unaccustomed to manual labor, hauling debris and hammering nails, became a source of amusement and admiration for the group. Despite his inexperience, he worked tirelessly, earning nods of respect from even the most skeptical volunteers. As the day stretched into evening, the group gathered around a makeshift fire pit in the middle of the street. Someone had brought a portable grill, and the smell of sizzling hot dogs and roasted marshmallows filled the air. Caleb sat beside Marlene and Rosie, his muscles aching from the day's work, but his spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. Across the fire, Richard handed a plate of food to Mrs. Price, his suit jacket long since abandoned in favor of a flannel shirt. "It's funny," Richard said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I came here to say thank you, but I think I'm the one who owes you all. Watching this community come together, it's something special." Mrs. Price raised her paper cup of coffee in a mock toast. "To Bayou Ridge, may we always rise together." The group echoed her sentiment, their voices filled with quiet determination. The next morning, Caleb woke early, the faint light of dawn creeping through the shelter's windows. Despite the soreness in his limbs, he felt a sense of purpose driving him forward. "Heading out already?" Marlene asked as she handed him a piece of toast. "Yeah," Caleb replied. "There's a lot to do. The sooner we start, the sooner we'll get back on our feet." Marlene smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "You're turning into quite the leader, Caleb." He shrugged, ducking his head. "Just doing what I can." As Caleb walked toward the neighborhood, he was joined by more volunteers, their ranks swelling with each passing day. What had started as a handful of people had grown into a full-scale effort, with teams assigned to different sections of town. By midweek, the rebuilding efforts hit a major setback. A supply truck carrying critical materials, plywood, nails, and roofing shingles, broke down on the outskirts of town. The driver called to report that the muddy roads were impassable without heavy equipment to tow the truck out. Caleb overheard the conversation and immediately stepped in. "We can't wait for help to come. If we don't get those supplies, we're dead in the water." Richard, who had become an integral part of the effort, nodded. "I'll call for reinforcements, but in the meantime, we need a plan." Caleb rallied a group of volunteers to clear the road, using shovels, boards, and sheer determination to create a passable path. After hours of grueling labor, the truck finally arrived, greeted by cheers from the waiting crowd. As the rebuilding efforts gained momentum, Caleb noticed a shift in the town's atmosphere. The despair that had once hung over Bayou Ridge like a fog was lifting, replaced by a sense of unity and hope. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now worked side by side, sharing tools and stories. Children played together in the streets, their laughter a welcome sound amidst the hammering and sawing. Even Richard, once a stranger to the town, had become a familiar and respected figure. He spent his evenings speaking with families, learning their stories, and offering support wherever he could. One evening, Caleb sat with Richard on the porch of a partially rebuilt house, the two of them watching the sun set over the slowly recovering town. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Caleb," Richard said. "Have you thought about what comes next? For you, I mean." Caleb shrugged. "I don't know. I just want to see Bayou Ridge back on its feet." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good goal, but don't sell yourself short. You've got the kind of leadership this world needs." Caleb looked out at the town, his heart swelling with pride and determination. "Then I'll make sure I use it." The air in Bayou Ridge was changing. Though the scars of the flood remained visible, mud-caked streets, shattered windows, and missing shingles, a sense of purpose had begun to replace the despair. Neighbors had become family, their laughter and chatter filling the streets as they worked side by side to rebuild their lives. Caleb, Marlene, and Rosie had settled into a rhythm, their days spent restoring their home and helping others do the same. "Feels like we've turned a corner," Marlene remarked, as she watched Caleb hammer a wooden plank into place on Mrs. Price's porch. Caleb paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Yeah, but there's still a lot to do." The sounds of hammers and saws echoed through the neighborhood, a testament to the collective effort. Caleb couldn't help but feel proud of how far they had come, but also wary. They needed something more than work to remind them why they were fighting so hard to rebuild. That evening, Caleb joined a gathering at the community center, a space that had been miraculously spared from the flood. Richard Garrison stood at the front of the room, his sleeves rolled up and a clipboard in hand. "We're making progress," Richard began, addressing the crowd. "But rebuilding isn't just about houses and streets. It's about our spirits, too." Caleb listened intently, an idea forming in the back of his mind. As the meeting wrapped up and people began to leave, he approached Richard. "I've been thinking," Caleb said, his tone cautious but hopeful. "What if we organize something, like a celebration? A way to bring everyone together, to show how far we've come?" Richard's eyes lit up. "You mean like a community event?" "Yeah," Caleb said, nodding. "It doesn't have to be big, just something to remind everyone what we're fighting for." Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "That's a great idea, Caleb. Let's make it happen." Word of the event spread quickly, and soon, the entire town was buzzing with excitement. Volunteers divided into teams to handle different aspects: decorations, food, entertainment, and logistics. Caleb found himself at the center of the planning, his natural leadership guiding the efforts. Rosie eagerly joined the decoration team, her small hands busy painting colorful signs and stringing up makeshift bunting made from old sheets. "Do you think people will like it?" she asked, her face smudged with paint. "They'll love it," Caleb assured her, smiling. Marlene took charge of organizing the food, working with neighbors to pool whatever ingredients they could salvage or donate. From casseroles to homemade pies, the menu quickly grew into a feast. Meanwhile, Richard tapped into his network to secure a stage and sound system, promising a surprise that he refused to reveal. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and bright, the first truly sunny day since the flood. Caleb stood in the town square, now transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Tables lined the streets, covered in food and flowers, while children ran around with balloons tied to their wrists. The stage, set up at one end of the square, was adorned with a simple banner that read, "Bayou Ridge, Rising Together." "Looks like everything's coming together," Richard said as he joined Caleb. Caleb nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "It's more than I imagined." As the townsfolk began to gather, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The celebration began with a series of short speeches. Marlene spoke first, her voice steady and full of emotion, as she thanked the community for their resilience and support. "Bayou Ridge isn't just a place," she said. "It's the people who make it what it is, and together we've proven that no storm can break us." Next, Richard took the stage, his usual calm demeanor giving way to a more personal tone. "I came here as a stranger," he admitted, "but I leave as part of your family. My father and I owe this town more than we can ever repay. Thank you for showing me what true strength looks like." Finally, Caleb was invited to speak. Nervously, he approached the microphone, glancing out at the crowd. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, earning a few chuckles. "But I just want to say thank you to all of you for showing me that even when everything feels lost, we can find a way to rebuild together." As he stepped down, the crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the square. The evening took on a festive tone as music filled the air. Richard's surprise turned out to be a local band he had hired, their upbeat tunes lifting everyone's spirits. Caleb found himself pulled into a makeshift dance circle by Rosie, her laughter infectious. "Come on, Caleb," she urged, spinning around him with unbridled joy. Even Marlene joined in, her feet moving to the rhythm as she laughed with neighbors. For a while, the weight of the flood's aftermath seemed to vanish, replaced by a sense of pure, unfiltered happiness. As the sun set and the crowd began to disperse, Caleb found a quiet spot near the edge of the square. He watched as families packed up leftovers and children dozed in their parents' arms. Richard approached, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "Thought you could use a drink," he said, handing one to Caleb. "Thanks," Caleb replied, taking a sip. Richard sat beside him, his gaze thoughtful. "You've done something incredible here, Caleb. This town owes you a lot." Caleb shook his head. "It's not about me, it's about all of us. We couldn't have done this alone." Richard smiled. "That's the mark of a true leader. You bring people together, Caleb. Never lose that." Later that night, Caleb walked home with Marlene and Rosie, the quiet streets illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. "That was a good day," Marlene said, her voice warm. "Yeah," Caleb agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. As they reached their house, still a work in progress, but unmistakably theirs, Caleb felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he felt certain they would make it. "We're going to be okay," he said, echoing words he had spoken so many times before, and for the first time, he truly believed it. The morning after the celebration dawned with an unusual stillness. The town square, which had been alive with music and laughter just hours before, was now quiet. The streets dotted with remnants of the previous night's festivities, scattered balloons, empty plates, and a lingering warmth that hung in the air. Caleb awoke early, the faint glow of sunrise casting golden hues through the shelter's windows. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air filled his lungs, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a profound sense of calm. The horizon stretched out before him, the floodwaters nearly gone, revealing patches of muddy earth and the skeletal remains of what had once been bustling streets. Despite the destruction, there was hope in the air, a belief that better days were ahead. Caleb found himself walking toward the Bayou Verde River, now reduced to a gentle flow after weeks of raging torrents. He stood at the bank, staring at the water as it meandered lazily through the town. Memories of the flood surged back, pulling Mr. Garrison from his porch, braving the waters with Rosie's encouragement, and the moment he had almost given up, but didn't. Marlene joined him, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. She handed it to Caleb without a word, standing beside him in quiet solidarity. "You've changed, Caleb," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "You're not just my boy anymore. You're a leader now." Caleb stared at the ripples in the water, the weight of her words settling in. "I just did what anyone would have done," he murmured. Marlene turned to face him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No, Caleb, not everyone would have done what you did. You saved lives. You brought this town back together. Don't downplay that." Caleb nodded slowly, a small smile creeping onto his face. "We all did our part." Marlene smiled back. "And that's what makes it special." Over the following days, the town of Bayou Ridge began to hum with renewed energy. Homes that had been half destroyed were now standing tall, their walls freshly painted and their porches sturdy. Streets that had once been rivers were now cleared of debris, with children running freely once more. Caleb dedicated his mornings to helping Mrs. Price with her garden, which had been ravaged by the flood. Together, they planted rows of flowers and vegetables, her wrinkled hands moving with surprising agility. "Plants are a lot like people," Mrs. Price said one day as she knelt in the soil. "You give them the right care, and they'll grow back stronger than ever." Caleb nodded thoughtfully, her words resonating deeply. One afternoon, Richard Garrison returned to Bayou Ridge, this time with a proposal that surprised Caleb and Marlene. Sitting on their partially rebuilt porch, Richard pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. "I've been talking to some folks in Baton Rouge," he began. "They're looking for young leaders to help with disaster response planning. Caleb, I think you'd be perfect for it." Caleb blinked in astonishment. "Me? Why?" Richard smiled. "Because you've already proven you can lead under the toughest circumstances. You have the heart, the courage, and the vision. They need people like you." Marlene's eyes shone with pride, though Caleb could see the hint of hesitation in her expression. "It's a big step," she said, "but it's a good one." Caleb glanced at Rosie, who was playing with her stuffed bear nearby. "What about you two?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Marlene squeezed his hand. "We'll be fine, Caleb. You've given us the strength to move forward. Now, it's your turn to do something bigger." The day of Caleb's departure arrived sooner than he expected. The town gathered to see him off, their faces a mix of sadness and pride. Mrs. Price handed him a basket of freshly baked muffins, and Mr. Jenkins gave him a firm handshake. "Don't forget where you came from," Jenkins said with a grin, "and don't let those city folks change you." Richard drove Caleb to the bus station, the black SUV now speckled with mud from weeks of service in Bayou Ridge. As they waited for the bus, Richard turned to Caleb. "You know, my father talks about you all the time," Richard said. "Says you're the bravest kid he's ever met. I think he's right." Caleb smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Tell him I said thank you, and thank you for everything." The bus ride to Baton Rouge felt like the beginning of a new adventure. As the miles rolled by, Caleb stared out the window, his mind filled with memories of Bayou Ridge. He thought of the people he had met, the lives he had touched, and the lessons he had learned. By the time the city skyline came into view, Caleb felt ready for whatever lay ahead. He carried Bayou Ridge with him in his heart, knowing that no matter where life took him, the spirit of his hometown would always guide him. Months later, Caleb returned to Bayou Ridge for a visit. The transformation was astonishing. The town square buzzed with activity, the houses gleamed with fresh coats of paint, and the gardens were in full bloom. Rosie ran to greet him, her laughter ringing through the air as she hugged him tightly. "You're back!" she exclaimed, her eyes shining with joy. "I told you I would be," Caleb said, ruffling her hair. Marlene emerged from the house, her smile radiant. "We've missed you, Caleb, but we've been keeping busy." As they walked through the town, Caleb marveled at how much had changed, and how much had stayed the same. Bayou Ridge was still home, but it was stronger, brighter, and more united than ever. That evening, Caleb stood on the same hill where he had first watched the floodwaters recede. The town stretched out before him, bathed in the warm glow of sunset. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had happened, the struggles, the triumphs, and the connections that had changed his life forever. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Caleb whispered to himself, "We did it. Together." And for the first time, He truly understood the power of resilience, community, and hope. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Caleb's story reminds us of the incredible power of courage and kindness. Even in the face of overwhelming challenges, it's proof that small acts of bravery can ripple through a community and change lives forever. What would you have done in Caleb's shoes? Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's kindness changed your life? Or when you had the chance to make a difference for someone else? We'd love to hear your stories and thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more heartwarming tales that inspire and uplift. Until next time, remember, even the smallest act of kindness can spark the biggest changes.